Joining us on the show to talk about the current effort to reopen New York and the number of changes coming from Albany is New York State Senator George Borrello. Senator, great to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be back, Justin. Thank you for having me.
First off, let's talk about that reopening process. Governor Andrew Cuomo announced just a little while ago that it's official. Western New York is moving to Phase 3 on Tuesday. For you, what does this change mean for our communities?
Well, again, it's the return to economic activity. It's the return to somewhat normal practices, if you will, although under many restrictions. But we have seen ourselves kind of redevelop, and I think it's critically important. We can't do it fast enough, in my opinion. However, it has to be done safely. So I understand the careful and cautious manner in which it has to happen. But from an economic standpoint, the damage that it is doing to our state and our nation is really going to have, every day that goes by is going to even have a longer term impact on our ability to recover fully from this crisis.
Your office has been directly involved with a lot of the reopening process, coming up with the plan to get us to the different regions reopening as well here in Western New York. Do you hear a lot of feedback from businesses in the community, and what are they asking or talking to you about during these reopening processes?
Well, we field a lot of questions from people, from business owners, from individuals on a number of topics when it comes to the reopening. Much of this reopening plan, the governor makes an announcement, and then the actual guidance sometimes doesn't come out for days after that announcement. So that creates a lot of questions. The biggest questions are, what phase do I fall in if I'm a business owner? And, can I do this or can't I do that? Unfortunately, most of the guidance that we have received from the governor's office is still vague. And so we are oftentimes engaging with his office, his representatives, to get, rulings, if you will, as to how a particular situation fits into the reopening. So we've done a tremendous amount of advocacy on behalf of our individuals and businesses as part of this reopening. We're still seeing a lot of people who are struggling to get their unemployment benefits. Our offices, in Jamestown, Olean, and Albany have all been working with constituents. And, I really I'm very proud of my team and how they have, in this unprecedented crisis, have truly helped so many people, literally thousands of people that have had issues. I'm proud of how they've handled that and be able to help people navigate that. It's really now a process of trying to continue to push and advocate on behalf of those businesses, to continue to push to ensure that this reopening is done fairly and equitably, which has been a challenge since day one, and to continue to ensure that the voice of our region is heard loud and clear in Albany. And I'm proud to say, with the support of people like Assemblyman Andy Goodell, Assemblyman Joe Giulio, and many others, we have been able to really change, move the needle and change the rules of engagement here to the benefit of our region. And I'm very proud of that.
Now, the reopening process, much like the shutdown, appears to be at the hands of the governor. Are lawmakers at all involved in that process, or is it all mostly coming from his office?
Well, based on the way this was structured, you go back to the March 3rd vote to give him unprecedented power, which I voted against. It ultimately puts the power in his hands exclusively, which is not only a violation of our state constitution directly, it's also a violation of the idea of separation of powers and co-equal branches of government. But this is power that was ceded to him by the majority of legislators that voted in favor of it. That being said, an executive does have the authority, and I believe the correct authority, to act quickly on things in an emergency. But we are going on 3 months now. And, I believe that this has gone on too long. We've seen a lot of overreach on the part of the governor, things that are unrelated completely to the pandemic, which we saw just in the last couple of days. And ultimately, it needs to have accountability. I have introduced legislation co-sponsored in the Assembly by Assemblyman Goodell and Assemblyman Giulio to require the governor to come back to the state legislature every 30 days for the reauthorization of his emergency power. I think that's appropriate. I think that's the role, at the very minimum, that is the role that this legislature should play, is to ensure that his powers are still, the sweeping authority that they gave him still needs to be in place in its entirety as we move through this. Because we gave him 14 months of unprecedented power back in March when they gave this authority, this executive authority. Again, unlike any other state in the nation, I believe there's only one other governor, by the way, that has the right to, in an emergency situation, write his own laws, his or her own laws. And that's what our governor has right now. He has the ability to write laws. Again, that is a direct violation of our state's constitution. So, the legislature has not done enough, in my opinion, to curb this power, to be the check and balance that's required. We have been derelict in our duty. We were in Albany just for a handful of days to pass largely politically charged and unrelated to COVID legislation. We have still failed our small businesses by not providing necessary relief. We've failed our families. We failed our local governments and all of those that are impacted by them by not standing up and not just standing up to the governor, but standing up for those people and ensuring that throughout this process, their voices are listened to, and that legislation reflects that. So I've introduced several pieces of legislation along with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I might add, to not only curb his power, but to ensure that things like the unemployment insurance rates, which are going to skyrocket, which is going to be devastating for small businesses, especially as a result of the fact that we had this forced shutdown and these forced layoffs. I mean, I can tell you from my own personal experience as a business owner, my wife and I, employ over 200 people normally. We're having a difficult time getting people back to work. And at the same time, the unemployment claims pile up on my wife's desk every day. So that is going to have an impact on insurance rates, unemployment insurance rates, dramatically. And I've introduced legislation to hold harmless businesses for those increases in unemployment insurance experience ratings, is what's referred to, the experience rating that determines what your rate will be for insurance. And there is similar calls in Washington to do the same thing. And this needs to happen because this pandemic was certainly an act of God, but the mishandling of unemployment, the mishandling of our shutdown, that was an act of government, and our businesses and families should not suffer as a result.
And you mentioned that there is some sort of Democrat support to the bringing back of the governor's power. How crucial is that going to be in getting that piece of legislation through Albany? Because it was the Democrats who support the governor who originally pushed it through so quickly to give him that power.
Well, and I think that because that power was wrapped up with funding to fight the COVID pandemic, that's why so many on both sides of the aisle were reluctant to vote against it. But again, as a veteran of local government, and really as a student of what our government should be, the proper role and the separation of powers that is required, I could not support that, and it was difficult for people. But I also said, if you go back to my comments on the floor that night, I said any legislature that would cede this much power to the governor will be very reluctant to take it away, and that's what we're seeing right now. I also said that the sweeping authority would allow him to do things that are completely unrelated to the emergency powers granted to him under this pandemic, and we saw that recently. He just issued an executive order requiring all police departments to basically come up with reforms. It's vague. It doesn't have any requirements. It's threatening local government funding if those changes aren't made. But yet there are no standards that come along with that. So how is this? You may think police reform is needed. I'm not going to argue that point. But how is this related to the pandemic? How is this related to emergency authority granted to him and funding and budgetary powers granted to him to address the pandemic? It's not. So this is overreach by the governor. Again, it goes against not only the Constitution, but it even goes against the spirit of the law that was passed. And that's why there needs to be the return of the co-equal branches of government. And we need to have our state legislature step forward and do its job.
And to those that point of changes in law enforcement, one of the biggest last week was the repeal of 50A, which is a
Hmm.
section of state law that protected the privacy rights of police officers and first responders, and specifically when they are under investigation themselves. For you, what was the main point that had you vote against that repeal? Because there were a lot of voices out there who said there needed to be some sort of modification to the law, maybe not the full repeal, though.
Well, it's the same thing that we faced with bail reform. There was no discussion. There were no meaningful hearings or anything that would have allowed us to have a thoughtful dialogue that included all stakeholders, so that we could have meaningful change. I mean, it is very lopsided. This is the repeal of their civil rights. Now, some would argue that that all of those files need to be public access, but one important difference between law enforcement and others is that unsubstantiated claims, false claims, which police officers receive numerous amounts of false claims of abuse, remain on their record forever. They are never expunged. Other professions, they have different standards. One of the where they are expunged, especially if they're unsubstantiated. There are other states that don't have 50A. That's one of the arguments, that we should repeal it because other states don't have it. But other states do expunge unsubstantiated claims from the records of law enforcement and other professions. This is just a tool to create, what could ultimately end up in violence and in discrediting people unnecessarily. No one everyone should be afforded their due process. This essentially removes the due process for a certain segment of the population. This essentially allows false and unsubstantiated claims to be used against someone, particularly in the court of public opinion on social media. This would allow the mob rule to take false information and use it against them. And during the floor debate on this topic, one of my colleagues who debated the sponsor of this bill said, you've made other changes to the public officers law. Why did you not make a change that would either continue to conceal or expunge unsubstantiated claims from the records? And the response was, just because it's unsubstantiated doesn't mean it didn't happen. Well, that's the very nature of innocent until proven guilty. That's a violation of their constitutional rights, of their civil rights. How is that not just some kind of a knee-jerk reaction that whether it's intentional or unintentional, will strip them of their civil rights and of their right to due process? That's why I could not support the repeal of it. Like, once again, like we saw with bail reform, a political hatchet job that is ultimately going to make us less safe and make it very, very difficult for us to have proper law and order in our state.
Now, there is a lot of emotion and call for change surrounding Mr. Floyd's death. We've seen it here in Jamestown, where folks are taking to the street in fairly large protests for this area. But we've also seen discussion between officials here in the city, between police chiefs, Sheriff Quattrone at Chautauqua County's level, speaking directly with them and answering their questions and bringing ideas to the table. Is there anything in the works to try to bring a more balanced approach to these police reforms rather than trying to just rush them through? Or is that the way that we're going to continue to do this now in Albany?
Well, I would like to say that there were calls for us to have proper hearings, for us to have discussions and sit down. But it's been all about demonizing people, demonizing law enforcement. And the sides have come down so starkly opposite of each other. But I will say this. When you see peaceful protests like you've seen in Jamestown and other parts of Western New York, with the exception of Buffalo, unfortunately, when you can see people engaging in meaningful dialogue, it gives me hope that we can do this. But to do it in this manner, we are making snap decisions without having all the information and creating potential for devastating unintended consequences is not the proper way. So yes, we should sit down and have that conversation, but it has to include real information, not rhetoric. It needs to include real conversation, not yelling and screaming at each other. And it needs to include a true and honest effort to have reforms made not for the purposes of grandstanding, not for the ulterior motives and secret agendas of people that have political aspirations, but for the true reason that we need to make our communities more safe and ensure that at the same time that law enforcement is equitable for everyone. And those particular conversations right now are not happening in Albany.
All right, but as you mentioned, they are happening here in Jamestown, so certainly a
Yes.
little light there
Yes.
in that. State Senator George Borrello joining us today. Sir, thank you so much for your time and your input on these topics. We appreciate it.